I don't have my phone. Video had it watching PJ Masks in the line and got upset that he couldn't put the groceries on the conveyor belt. So I took the phone from him and had it in hand and was sure I had it. I even checked my cart to see if I put it in there before I left, just because I have to. And for the 3.5 years he's been alive, I've not lost my phone. And I have no recollection of where I put it. And we have 2 services on it. And somebody turned the phone off. Just say it's off. And I didn't want to be like everybody else, and I refused. I had just a phone. Because I didn't want to go into the 21st century. I didn't expect to live past, I was supposed to go home young, which happened 3 years ago. The last year you could say young was 3 years ago. No longer young. And if you say otherwise, I believe that you are mentally incapacitated because you don't understand the human experience. An only promise from the Bible, 13 years. 13 more years. Makes you very old. Anyway. So it appears she did answer it. 13, 12. And the last 12 went by so fast and were so fruitless. If the English had captured Joan, then Charles the VII, the seventh, would have flown the country. The Troyes would have held good, and France, already English property, would have become, without further dispute, an English province, to so remain until the Judgment Day. A nationality and a kingdom were at stake, and no more time to decide it in than it takes to hard boil an egg. It was the most momentous 10 minutes that the clock had ever ticked in France, or ever will. Whenever you read in histories about hours or days or weeks in which the fate of one or another nation hang in the balance, do not you fail to remember not your French hearts to beat the quicker for the remembrance. The 10 minutes that France, called otherwise Joan of Arc, lay bleeding on the fosse that day, with 2 nations struggling over her for her possession. And you will not forget the dwarf, for he stood over her and did the work of any 6 of the others. He swung his axe with both hands. Whenever it came down, he said those 2 words, "For France!" And a splintered helmet flew like eggshells, and the skulls that carried it had learned its manners and would offend the French no more. He piled a bulwark of ironclad dead in front of him and fought from behind it. And at last, when the victory was ours, we closed about him, shielding him, and he ran up a ladder with Joan as easily as another man would carry a child, and bore her out of the battle. A great crowd followed, and anxious, for that she was drenched with blood to her feet, half of it her own and the other half English. Her bodies had fallen across her as she lay, and had poured their red life streams over her. One couldn't see the white armor now, with that awful dressing over it. The iron bolt was still in the wound. Some say it projected out behind the shoulder. It may have. I did not wish to see it, and did not try to. It was pulled out, and for pain, Joan cried again, poor thing. Some say she pulled it out herself because others refused, saying they could not bear to hurt her. As to this, I do not know. I only know it was pulled out, and that the wound was treated with oil and people dress. and properly dressed. Joan lay on the grass, weak and suffering, hour after hour, but still insisting that the fight go on, which it did, but not to much purpose, for it was only under her eye these men were heroes and not afraid. They were like the paladin. I think he was afraid of his shadow. I mean, in that afternoon, when it's a very big and long. When he was under Joan's eye and the inspiration of her great spirit, what was he afraid of? Nothing in this world, and that is just the truth. Pray for us, Joan. Toward night, Dumois gave it up. Joan heard the bugles. What? She cried, sounding the retreat. Her wound was forgotten in a moment. She countermanded the order and sent another to the officer in command of a battery, instead ready to fire 5 shots in quick succession. There was a signal to a force on the Orleans side of the river under La Hire, who was not, as some of the histories say, with us. It was to be given whenever Joan should feel sure the boulevard was about to fall into her hands. Then that force must make a counterattack on the Tourelles by the way of the bridge. Well, that guy's making lines. This does not have lines. It'd be pretty with lines. This does not have lines. Anyway. Joan mounted her horse, now with her staff about her, and when our people saw us coming, they raised a great shout and were at once eager for another assault on the boulevard. Joan rode straight to the fosse, where she had received her wound, and standing there in the rain of bolts and arrows, she ordered the paladin to let her long standard blow free, and to note when its fringes should touch the fortress. Presently he said, "It touches. Now then," said Joan to the waiting battalion, "the place is yours. Enter. In. Bugles sound the assault. Now, then, all together, go." And go it was. You never saw anything like it. We swarmed up the ladders and over the battlements like a wave. And the place was our property. Why, one might have 1,000 years and never see so gorgeous a thing as that again. There, hand to hand, we fought like wild beasts, for there was no give up to those English. There was no way to convince one of these people but to kill him, and even then he doubted. At last, so it was thought, in those days, and maintained by many. We were busy and never heard the 5 cannon shots fired, but they were fired a moment after Joan had ordered the assault. And so, while we were hammering and being hammered in the smaller fortress, the reserve on the Orleans side poured across the bridge and attacked the Tourelles from the side. A fireboat was brought down and moored under the drawbridge which connected the Tourelles with our boulevard. Wherefore, when at last we drove our English ahead of us, and they tried to cross that drawbridge and join their friends in the Tourelles, the burning timbers gave way under them and emptied them in a mass into the river in their heavy armor, and a pitiful sight it was to see brave men die such a death as that. Ah, God pity them, said Joan, and wept to see the sorrowful spectacle. She said these gentle words and wept these compassionate tears, although one of those perishing men had grossly insulted her with a coarse name 3 days before, when she had sent him a message asking him to surrender. That was their leader, Sir William Glasdale, a most valorous knight. He was clothed all in steel, so he plunged under the water like a lance, and of course came up to no more. We soon patched a sort of bridge together and threw ourselves against the last stronghold of the English power that barred Orleans from friends and supplies. Before the sun was quite down, Joan's forever memorable day's work was finished. Her banner floated from the fortress of the Tourelles. Her promise was fulfilled. She had raised the siege of Orleans. The 7 months' beleaguerment was ended. The thing which the first generals of France had called impossible was accomplished. In spite of all that the king's ministers and war councils could do to prevent it, this little country maid of 17 had carried her immortal task through and had done it in 4 days. If God is for us, who can be against us? Since God allowed my keys to say to go, so I'm good. I can't hand it over to him. Good news travels fast, sometimes as well as bad. By the time we were ready to start homewards by the bridge, the whole city of Orleans was one red flame of bonfires, and the heavens blushed with satisfaction to see it. And the booming and bellowing of cannons and the banging of bells surpassed by great odds anything that ever Orleans had attempted before in the way of noise. When we arrived, well, there is no describing that. Why, those acres of people that we plowed through shed tears enough to raise the river. There was not a face in the glare of those fires that hadn't tears streaming down it, that hadn't tears streaming down it. And if Joan's feet had not been protected by iron, they would have kissed them off of her. Welcome, welcome to the Maid of Orleans. That was the cry. I heard it 100,000 times. Welcome to our maid. Some of them worded it. No other girl in all history has ever reached such a summer of glory as Joan of Arc reached that day. And do you think it turned her head and that she sat up to enjoy that delicious music of homage and applause? No. Another girl would have done that, but not this one. That was the greatest heart and the simplest that ever beat. That was the greatest heart and the simplest that ever beat. She went straight to bed and to sleep like any tired child. And when the people found she was wounded and would rest, they shut off all passage and traffic in the region and stood guard themselves the whole night through to see that her slumbers were not disturbed. They said, "She has given us peace, she shall have peace herself." All knew that the region would be empty of English the next day, and all said that neither the present citizens nor the posterity would ever cease to hold that day sacred to the memory of Joan of Arc. That word has been true for more than 60 years. It will continue as always. Orleans will never forget the 8th of May, not ever fail to celebrate it. It is Joan of Arc's day and holy. It is still celebrated every year with civic and military pomps and solemnities.